Well, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Andrea Webster and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, which is hosted by Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute. I want to start our webinar today by acknowledging that we are here at IU in Bloomington, a place where we have buildings and classrooms that are built on Indigenous homelands and resources. We express our gratitude to the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. The topic of today's webinar is addressing climate change in your comprehensive plan, one that was very topic. We had a lot of registrants for today, and all attendees are muted, but you can unmute yourself at the end to ask a question, or you can enter your question into the chat function. We encourage you to do that throughout the presentations and we'll hold them through the end. You can access that chat function by hovering your mouse over the Zoom window. So we are recording the webinar as usual, and I'll share a link to that recording along with any follow-up resources, probably on Friday or early next week. And we hope that you'll share those links and resources with your friends and colleagues and encourage them to attend our future webinars. So now I'd like to introduce you to today's moderator, Janet McCabe, who is the director of IU's Environmental Resilience Institute. Janet?
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you, Andrea, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. We really do have a big crowd for today, and I can understand why, because this is a topic that I've really been eager to present a webinar to folks on. Community updates to their comprehensive plans can really allow communities to bring climate change preparedness and response into the planning process, which is the business of local governments, right? And it can lay the groundwork for future ordinance and policies and activities that become the day-to-day work of that community. It often takes regulatory mechanisms and long-term planning to truly address local climate vulnerabilities. And one of the best ways to do that is by including climate change in a comprehensive plan. So we're thrilled today to have IU Assistant Professor Aaron Delat, the City of Richmond GIS Coordinator Matt Evans, and the Richmond Sustainability Commission Chair Allison Zeidel presenting today. Between Aaron's research on how local governments can advance sustainable economic and community development and the practical experience that Allison and Matt have implementing the City of Richmond's comprehensive plan, we're going to hear some great information on addressing climate change in comprehensive plans. Our webinar series is coordinated by Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute. In addition to our webinar series, we have many other resources available to local governments and the general public. Here are some of them listed. I'll draw your attention to the nice big logo there, the Indiana Environmental Reporter. This is just an amazing creation that IU has developed over the last 3 years. It reports on environmental issues across the country and throughout the state in a non-political way. It's independent journalism. Through their reporting, IER is working to make science and environmental information available to all Hoosiers, and the stories that are published on the Indiana Environmental Reporter are available to any news outlet anywhere to use at no cost as long as they attribute to IER. So we're really proud of that. I'll do a little advertisement right now for next month's webinar. This is, we took a break in January, so this is our first webinar of 2021. But we'll have a good roster of sessions for you throughout the year. Next month's webinar is going to focus on addressing climate change risk in multi-hazard mitigation plans. Another kind of standard thing that communities do, and bringing climate change as something that people need to know about to do their planning, but also as something to plan for and around. Is a really great opportunity. So hopefully you will want to come back for that. And if you are so moved to spread the word, that would be great. I also like to mention a couple of other key resources that I think can be really useful to local governments. One is the Sustainable Development Code. That is not an IU product. It's actually multiple universities across the country have come together to put this together. It's really comprehensive. It's this great database that has numerous resources for local governments who are working on environmental issues. It's organized by category. It gives good, better, and best practice suggestions for things like how do you remove barriers that might be in your municipal code for renewable energy, open space, or native planting, whatever it is, creating incentives, filling regulatory gaps. It's just really a great resource. They have guidance, for example, on how to include green zones, agricultural overlay zoning, transit-oriented zoning, all kinds of stuff that you might be thinking about in the context of a comprehensive plan. And the resources are very detailed and specific. They help you with what processes are used, what effects and different changes have, and gives lots of examples of communities that have done these sorts of things. So I commend that to you most heartily. I'll also mention just briefly that, that the ERI last month put out a model solar ordinance. This is for Indiana communities. It was designed specifically based on the kinds of ordinances that we have here in Indiana, and it represents choices for communities who may want to put language in their ordinances about solar energy based on best practices and opportunities that we found in other places. So that's pretty easy to find on our website if you're interested in that. I would like, as always, to thank Accelerate Indiana Municipalities, the Association of Indiana Counties, Health by Design, and the Indiana Public Health Association for their continued support of this webinar series and of other things that ERI does around the state. And I would like to thank everybody who's attending today. I think it's fun for me always to see how far afield people have come from and where they come from. Local governments are, of course, a main aspect of our audience, but lots and lots of other people come to attend too. So I think that slide flashed by for a moment, but maybe it'll flash by again. There it is. So it's not just Indiana listeners, and we're happy to have this material be shared just far and wide. I want to make a point about equity and inclusion. We know that while comprehensive planning can help communities bring climate change preparedness and response into their thinking, it also gives communities one more opportunity to advance equity and justice in their communities, which I know is a very high priority. Communities, we know that certain communities bear a disproportionate burden of the impacts of climate change, as well as many other aspects of modern life. People of color and communities with low incomes are already feeling the impacts of climate change more often, more severely than other communities, and often are less resilient in every sense of the word. And you can see here some of the data that supports that. So during the comprehensive planning process, that's an opportunity for communities to look at their responsibilities to ensure fairness and equity, both in process and in outcome, to make sure that that's interwoven into all their planning actions. And fortunately, there are resources and tools that can help local governments as they try to do that. So I am now going to introduce our three wonderful speakers. I'm going to introduce them all now, and then I will go on mute. You won't see or hear from me again until the very end, and they will just hand it off one to the other. So first we're going to hear from Aaron Delat, an assistant professor at the IU O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. He also directs the Metropolitan Governance and Management Transitions Laboratory. Aaron's research focuses on the roles that public managers play in enhancing economic, environmental, and social sustainability at the local and metropolitan level, with the goal of building cumulative knowledge that can help local governments advance sustainable economic and community development. And that, if that doesn't sound like exactly the kind of academic researcher and policy person that ought to be presenting at an ERI webinar and working closely with us, I can't imagine somebody who would be better suited. So we're thrilled to have Aaron here. Matt Evans is the GIS coordinator for the City of Richmond, and he is chair of Richmond's Environmental Sustainability Commission. He graduated from Earlham College in 2018, focusing on geology and chemistry. He interned with the Wayne County GIS office for a year and a half before graduating, which allowed him to become passionate about working in local government. Go, Matt. Local government is the best. After graduation, he joined the City of Richmond as a planning technician, and within the city's Department of Infrastructure and Development, he's served as interim city planner. He's worked with the Environmental Resilience Institute's Resilience Cohort Program since 2019, helping to write the city's 2018 greenhouse gas inventory and continuing to work on their climate action plan, and is a good friend of ERI. And Allison Zeidel is a member of the City of Richmond Environmental Sustainability Commission and a resiliency coordinator for Earth Charter Indiana, another great partner working around the state on climate action and resilience. Allison was heavily involved in integrating climate change into Richmond's comprehensive plan. She's the former executive director of Cope Environmental Center and recently started a business as a nonprofit consultant and project manager. So I am going to hand it over to Aaron first, who will then hand it off. Please know that you can put questions in the chat function at any time. When you think of it, is often the best time to put them in there. And you can, there'll be opportunities for you to unmute yourself and ask a question. With that, I will hand it over to Aaron and see you at the end of the webinar.
Thank you very much, Janet, everyone. My name is Aaron DeLotte. I'm in my second year here in Indiana at the O'Neill School. Before that, I worked in several other states at the state legislatures and also at the local level. So a bit of a mixed academic practitioner background. We're leading off here with the academic presentation, so I'm not going to try to offer any specific kind of tools or best practices. We'll leave that to Allison and Matt to talk about their experience. But I'm going to offer here very quickly a few basic observations and a suggested sort of approach, which I'm talking about, which relates to sort of systems thinking and comprehensive planning. Also, I have a new screen set up, so if for some reason my slides are not advancing, I'd appreciate if someone yells at me. This happened in class the other day, and it was fairly embarrassing. That being said, all right, you can see my observation one, right?
So we're seeing your not the full screen version.
Oh, you're not seeing the full screen version. Okay, that's why I asked for help. Awesome. Let's do this instead. Full screen version now?
Yes, it looks great.
Excellent. All right. So observation number one, the sort of overarching theme today, comprehensive planning. I would argue that comprehensive planning, whether expressly or not, is already on a glide path towards dealing with climate change. It's just getting impossible now to look out to a planning horizon, like 2040 or 2050, and not try to build into your forecasts or into your sort of scenarios how climate is going to impact the planning that you need to do, not just in terms of weather or climatic impacts, but also technological changes. So as the academic, I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson for a split second. Most of you probably are going to get are already familiar with this, but planning really began as an inventory of infrastructure. So modern city planning, if you go back to sort of the Plan of Chicago, 1909, which is sort of hailed as the first comprehensive plan, began as a private initiated document that warehoused a series of infrastructure investments that the city of Chicago needed to make in the future in order to deal with the coming sort of population changes that were going to occur. So the Plan of Chicago took into account where transportation would need to be built, aligning sort of roadways with freight, street widening, overpasses, the need for construction of Union Station, heavily infrastructure focused. And the city, in receipt of this plan, decided they needed some other body to try to implement this. So that led to the first planning commission that was created. We've come a long way since 1909. Today, comprehensive planning is widespread, of course, across the United States, but the way that comprehensive planning is utilized varies from state to state. Roughly half the states in the United States specify elements that need to be contained in a comprehensive plan. Some states require local governments, cities and counties to adopt comprehensive plans. Some do not. Florida, which is one place where I spent a lot of time, required cities and counties to adopt comprehensive plans, required specific elements to be in those plans, and required regular updates to those plans. Florida and some other states went so far as to, in their growth management regimes, to tie infrastructure funding to these comprehensive plans. So requiring things like roadways and other infrastructure to be provided concurrently with approval of new development as a way to sort of try to ensure that that infrastructure was provided in line with the coming sort of population changes. So this is not the approach that all states took, obviously. This is tended to show up more in fast growing states, but we've seen obviously sort of a widespread sort of utilization of comprehensive planning. Back when I was in grad school, one of my advisors, Timothy Chapin at Florida State, wrote an article in 2012 where he really traced this evolving sort of stages of growth planning. He categorized these into three different eras and argued we were entering a new era of growth planning. The first was sort of the era of growth controls, where states like Oregon began sort of implementing urban service boundaries and tools like that. The era of comprehensive planning, which ran from roughly 1975 to 2000, where we start to see cities adopting comp plans, developing those, hiring their own in-house planners. And then an era of smart growth, where we started to focus more on aesthetics, on livability, placemaking, key concepts like that. And so back in 2012, when this article came out, though, we were starting to see an emergence of a new era of sustainable growth. And in the article, Chapin distinguishes this era from the previous era by an explicit focus on climate change and energy demand and supply. So these are starting to become defining issues as long ago as roughly a decade ago now. So the idea of working climate action or climate change, accounting for that in comprehensive planning is really not a new concept. So let me take a brief diversion and talk about what sustainability means. This is, as an academic, really important to nail down definitions, and I'm going to argue that it would be important for planners as well. Lots of different people have lots of different definitions for what sustainability means. If you look at the practitioner literature, corporate sustainability, there are the typical sort of 3 E's used in environment, economy, and equity, and attempting to achieve some sort of balance with those. In the corporate world, you'll see the definition of triple bottom line show up, which is, again, trying to balance social, environmental, and financial benefits. These definitions are very ambiguous. And so if we're going to try to talk about incorporating climate action into a comprehensive planning framework, it's really important to, I think, have a better, more operational definition of what sustainability is. So I tend to like to define sustainability as a goal or series of goals tied to collectively determined performance measures. So we're talking about here sort of system performance. With this definition, scenarios are going to be more or less sustainable based on the metrics of system performance that you define. So sustainability here isn't a destination. It's simply a measure of whether you are reaching the destination or not. Who determines the destination? That is what the community is tasked with doing, and you as the planner in guiding. So planning, again, is the act of achieving sort of more sustainable system performance. The reason why I'm harping on infrastructure here at the beginning of this lecture is that comprehensive planning from its genesis is a process of attempting to identify infrastructure and infrastructure needs. Where do we need to build roads? Where are we going to build houses? Where are we going to put more commercial? Where do we need more land? Where do we need more houses again? Where do we need more roads? This sort of cycle. And this is sort of, if it's approached from that perspective, really only half the picture, because this human infrastructure or social infrastructure interacts with the natural environment. There's no way to engage in any kind of long-term development pattern without having ecological environmental impacts. Planners already know this. So when we're talking about systems thinking, what we're really talking about is just breaking down the components of human settlement into the natural resource system, the public infrastructure, where the users are, and where the providers are. So we think about this from a sort of systems perspective. We're really thinking about how do we provide the public infrastructure in order to accommodate sort of development and where we want to go. Using this sort of thinking, sustainability means we are, as in the planning process, are trying to generate knowledge about the dynamics, right? The change that is occurring between these natural and social systems. Most comprehensive plans today, if you take them apart, they get good data on changes to the human systems, right? They look at the population growth that's forecast. They look at transportation forecasting. They don't necessarily incorporate natural infrastructure changes. They don't think about the natural infrastructure as being dynamic, as what's going to change over time. And as a result of that, it's really difficult a lot of times to find forecasts from 20 or 30 years ago that are extremely accurate or really, accurately capture what reality looks like right now. So again, that's my little diversion into what I mean by systems thinking. So let's get back to the nuts and bolts of planning. This is in Indiana's code, what is required in terms of comprehensive plan elements. Indiana requires a statement of objectives for the future development of the jurisdiction, a statement of policy for the land use development, a statement of policy for the development of public ways, public places, public lands, structures, utilities. So infrastructure, right? Most of this you can categorize as a statement about the policy that's going to be in place for the development or provision of these different types of infrastructure. There are a number of optional elements, though, that are also allowed in Indiana, including optional parks and recreation elements, transit elements, natural resource protection, conservation, flooding, flood control, rather, farmland protection, education, and redevelopment of blighted areas. So I would argue that in terms of a comprehensive planning framework, Indiana already has or does provide or allow for most of the sort of lanes you need in order to work climate action or climate planning into a comprehensive planning framework. Now, the Indiana Planner's Guide notes that Indiana's minimum requirements for a comprehensive plan are much less complex than in most other states. But I would say that presents a kind of trade-off, because more complexity oftentimes equates to less flexibility. And so less complexity might mean you have more freedom to try to work in your objectives or work in climate planning into all these areas. Because look at the optional areas there. I mean, which of those optional areas are not going to be impacted over the next 30 years by climate change? Okay, so let me get to my research part. So the question that we're all here for is, are Indiana cities addressing climate change in their comprehensive plans? My research lab, we are looking at this right now and trying to quantify the extent to which comprehensive planning in Indiana is being utilized for sustainability broadly, but climate change in particular. And if you look at all sort of 305 cities and towns in Indiana that have a population of 1,000 and up, we found so far roughly 178 comprehensive plans. So a majority of these cities have comprehensive plans already in place. That's encouraging. There are a few that we haven't quite figured out yet if they have a comp plan, like 3 or 4, but we think this is a pretty accurate sort of ratio. So, and what was surprising to us is a lot of very small towns do have comprehensive plans as well. And so that's kind of encouraging. But if you look at sort of a subsample of these cities, and roughly that we've selected sort of the top 23 municipalities, or those with a population of greater than 40,000, we found only 4 of these that actually address climate change or climate related actions explicitly. And those are Indianapolis, with which we'll set aside here for a minute because they're a different creature, South Bend, Bloomington, and Michigan City. If we jump into Michigan City's comprehensive plan, how do they directly or explicitly address climate change? Well, they have a strategy here, strategy 11.1.8, encourage community and individual action to mitigate climate change. And this is sort of largely a co-production, what we would call a co-production or citizen engagement sort of designed effort. Provide reliable and objective information that helps inform residents about the causes, impacts, and possible responses to climate change, involving the community in the development of proposed sustainability policies and programs. This builds buy-in and awareness, providing practical information that helps individuals reduce their GHG emissions, empowers them to take actions. And of course, they lay out a few actions and initiatives that they would take, which revolve around creating tailored plans, but also sort of performance metrics to try and achieve progress. Michigan City's plan is over 600 pages long. I tried to get through most of it yesterday, and that was a mistake. But I wanted to single out their comp plan because it, not only because it did expressly mention climate change, but it's just a really good comprehensive plan. They have a lot of stuff in there. So if you haven't had a chance to peruse Michigan City's comp plan, you should do so, but do set aside enough time to get through that. So does that mean, that Indiana's cities are really not sort of taking climate seriously, that they are not really taking climate action? And I would argue not necessarily, because if you look at, again, those same 23 municipalities, 17 of those do include conservation elements in their plans. 10 of them include policies for farmland preservation. 8 of them address flooding, and 7 of them address redevelopment, primarily through infill and other housing issues. So there are a range of optional elements that these cities and towns have incorporated into their comp plans that are ways for Indiana communities to quote unquote stay in their lanes and at the same time address climate change. Here's one that came up in my class the other day, the town of Cicero in Jackson Township. Their comp plan was adopted in 2015. And they have a number of of the optional elements included in their plan and their environmental analysis. They have air quality, floodplains, water quality. They talk a lot of that plan about the degrading sort of quality of lake water and other issues, without expressly mentioning climate change, but acknowledging that these are future challenges for the community. And so whether or not cities are expressly talking about climate change is impacting them. And so back to this question, are Indiana cities addressing climate change in their comp plans? I say address is a strong word, but they are dealing with it. And I've profiled 2 other plans I've been looking at recently. Goshen's comp plan, which was adopted in 2016. I think someone from Goshen is possibly on the webinar. So correct me if I get anything wrong. And then Fisher's, their 2040 plan, which was adopted in 2016. Both of these cities have engaged in greenhouse gas emissions inventorying. So they have been attempting to quantify their GHG emissions. And as far as I know, they are approaching what to do with that data in different ways. I believe Goshen is still working on their climate action plan, or perhaps they're getting close to wrapping that up. I'm not sure. And Fishers has opted to essentially work their climate action planning into their larger comprehensive plan update as an element of that plan. So I wanted to single out those two communities as cities that are addressing and have invested sort of resources into climate planning, or at least gathering the data that's going to be useful for climate planning. So let me jump to my second observation here, and that is that comprehensive planning needs scenarios and strategy. And these are statements that I'm generalizing by having looked at hundreds of these plans in multiple states. So what do I mean by scenarios? A lot of comprehensive planning will engage in some kind of scenario planning, where you perhaps engage in maybe a normative scenarios. You look at a future you want to accomplish, and then you sort of try to figure out how, what would have to change to get to this scenario. And maybe you compare that to the do nothing option or default. What happens if we just continue to allow development patterns to occur? There are some cities, though, that are engaging in exploratory scenario planning, where they don't just craft kind of two different scenarios. They craft multiple scenarios that reflect several different plausible alternative futures. And then they compare these as part of their sort of stakeholder and public engagement. And they use these different scenarios to try and create consensus for what we want to grow into. So Gwinnett County in Georgia is an example of a plan that took, or a community that took sort of a driving forces analysis and stakeholder analysis, and used it to develop several different scenarios and the impacts of those scenarios. And then they use the response and the insights from that scenario comparison to inform and sort of shape their comprehensive plan. There's an article that came out a few months ago in Journal of American Planning Association called Using Exploratory Scenarios in Planning Practice. I would recommend you go back and read that if you want to get more information about these specific cases. But a few bullet points from this process is that exploratory scenario planning lets you create these plausible alternatives and identify the driving forces. This is usually one limitation in the traditional comp plan. You might do transportation forecasts and compare a few different transportation scenarios. You'll usually have one forecast maybe for your population growth. And you don't really account for any of the environmental changes that you were likely to experience, or environmental condition changes. Or you might mention it, but it's not data that gets factored into or utilized in your actual forecasting or scenario creating. These plans, or this approach, involves communicating the risks, right? Not just sort of cheery futures, but actually the risks of future pandemics, future floods, extreme heat, pollution. This is a way for you to introduce these concepts that allows people to simply compare these different kinds of scenarios. It's important for this kind of an approach to present a positive vision for what citizens and governments can do together. But it's also a way of truth telling, right? And being honest about threats, and not just sort of what the future holds in terms of the broader environment, but where your organization and where your community has preparedness has lagged. Cities and local governments in general have not enjoyed a tremendous infusion of resources from states and federal governments in recent years. So it is, in my view, not a weakness or a bad idea to indicate this to the public and to stakeholders and citizens where it is necessary. Show where you are unprepared for the future.
Aaron, we have about 1 minute left.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So what are some ways to do that? Well, there are a few tools here I would suggest any local government of any size can pull from. One is the ERI Hoosier Resilience Index, where you can get data that is localized on extreme heat, precipitation, floodplain use, but also the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. That's a tool that you can utilize to identify more socially vulnerable neighborhoods within your community, and you can use these tools to try and create these types of scenarios that I'm talking about. What's key here, though, is to recognize that people tend to be loss averse, meaning policymakers, managers, and the public tend to be willing to take greater risks when they are faced with losses as opposed to gains. And so just presenting a cheery scenario about the future might not necessarily motivate the kind of support that you're looking for. Here are what some of these scenarios look like. In this case, this is sort of Gwinnett scenarios, where you're looking at a scenario of enduring urbanism, in which the consequences are continued sort of gentrification, a free agent economy scenario, a severe climate scenario, a transportation on demand scenario, and then an energy boom scenario. And they use these scenarios to sort of identify not just the consequences, but scenario-specific actions they would need to take, but also sort of universal actions that would apply to every scenario. So I think this is a really sort of a useful approach cities can take. The other thing I would point out is that comprehensive plans, and I'm closing here, comprehensive plans are really a strategic framework and need to be treated as such. If you want to craft a 600-page comprehensive plan and have your green infrastructure plan in there, your climate action planning, your capital improvement planning, all those things contained in one giant document, you can. But the comp plan is really useful as a strategic framework. So recognize that you use the comp plan within a broader ecology of plans. And one of the mistakes that I tend to observe with comp planning is that they just create lists. They create a large list and they don't really prioritize based on a deeper understanding of what their risks are. A lot of the really good comp plans have implementation elements. This would be very critical if you were trying to work in sustainability or climate action into your plan. There needs to be implementation. In public administration, we call implementation the place that good ideas go to die. And I think that's true in climate planning and comprehensive planning in particular. So here we're back at Michigan City's comp plan, and in their area of sustainability, resilience, and healthy communities, they do identify 3 different timeframes, what they're going to try to implement in years 1 through 3, what they'll try to implement in years 3 through 10, and then what is 10 or more years off. So lastly, recognize that we're all risk averse, but there's nothing wrong, and it's advantageous in my view to go ahead and put your organization on the clock by including some kind of short-term and long-term sort of timeframes for implementation. All right, I am done. So thank you very much, everyone.
Allison, you are muted.
Isn't that the classic thing that's been going on this year? Sorry about that. So I am from Richmond and we are below 40,000. So some of Aaron's numbers for towns above 40,000. Thankfully, our plan did incorporate climate action, and we actually even got the word resilience into the plan, which was remarkable. We're super excited about that. That was all due to the planning department and our consultants, so I can't take the credit for that one. But Matt and I are just going to touch on for a moment how our comprehensive plan is formed with environmental concerns and climate action in there, and then how we're actually formulating our climate action plan to match that. And the thing that we'll say probably several times is that the important thing to us is that the comprehensive plan has already been approved by our council. So that means that if we're following that comprehensive plan, the climate action plan will be easier to get through council and easier for people to embrace because the ideals in it have already been approved. So we're going to run through this somewhat quickly, and I want to take just a second. Thank you to Andrea and Janet's team has been amazing. We would not be this far without their team. So thanks to them, and also thanks to Earth Charter Indiana for allowing me to spend some time on this. That's been huge. We take advantage of the fact that we're a small town. So most of our planning and the way that Matt and I are working to get the climate action plan to agree with a comprehensive plan is because we have relationships with people. We are not shoving things down people's throats. We're not bullheading through a lot of things like that. We're trying to get people to trust us and trust that we're trying to do the best thing for the city. So we have no sustainability coordinator, which is important to note, and we'll come back to that in just a second. But here's a quick look, and I know the lettering is tiny on here, but the big things to see are in 2006, that was our last comprehensive plan. And then the most recent one was started in 2019 and completed and passed in 2020. But in between that time, the 2006 plan actually had a lot of sustainability stuff in it, but it was a huge plan. Aaron, it was probably a lot like Michigan City. I think we had like 500 pages or something. And the environment section was huge too. And you'll see that later in Matt's part. But there were several environmental pieces in there. So the Parks Master Plan happened because of the 2006 plan. We had a bike and pedestrian plan that came together. So a complete streets initiatives to help reduce the amount of places that required you to have a car to get from point A to point B. And then also our greenhouse gas emissions inventory did not come out of the plan, but certainly was supported by the plan. So early engagement of how we were able to get environmental stuff into this plan was tricky and a lot, but we kind of stuck with it there. So one of the most important things we did was ask our city planner to be on the Environmental Commission and to give an update every time she was there on the plan. So we knew the plan was happening. We knew that it was underway. And we asked her as just an agenda item on our agenda, Deandra gives an update on the comprehensive plan. That way we knew if there were decisions being made or if they were waiting for something or if there was a big meeting coming up, we knew about it and we could jump on that opportunity. And we asked anytime there was something that Deandra would tell us or Matt would tell us, like the survey's coming out or there's a public input meeting, we would make sure, okay, everybody in this room, all the commission members, fill out that form, make sure you're forwarding it to other people. And that survey was chunky. It was, Matt, probably what it took an hour to fill out. I mean, it took a long time to fill out, but stick with it, fill it out, be thoughtful with your answers, explain if you're in an area of expertise like water quality or something, explain yourself. And you can really see that that stuff came out in the plan. We have some really great things that I can almost hear the person's words that filled out that survey or were at that meeting. I can almost hear their words in the plan. We also use the Guide to Community Energy Strategic Planning. That's, you see the piece there on the right, and I believe Joe's going to put something in the chat so you can link to that. We use that as a guide. It is a very chunky document as well, but we did identify a couple areas of interest that Richmond could use, mostly related to energy, and pulled those out. And between a couple of members of the commission, we just kind of looked at what made sense and what didn't. The thing we should have done is spent more time with our utility, RPNL, which is our energy utility, picking those pieces out too. And that was stupid. It's something I would do different next time. But we took those, we summarized those into strategies, and then we sent those to the city planner and the consultant. Again, the reason we knew to do that is because she had given an update that they were working on a certain part of the plan. And so that triggered something in us to then go grab this strategic planning guide and figure out where we needed to grab energy pieces and put them in. So the other thing is that I mentioned this before and I'll mention it again. Our biggest thing was building trust. So we have spent a lot of time in Richmond building trust among the political parties, making sure that any environmental stewardship or any sustainability moves are not thought of as kind of aggressive and just far left movements, that this is something everybody needs to be involved in. So we built coalitions and made sure that everybody was on our side. So this is, for instance, just an email to our mayor saying, hey, we know that we are in the middle of this planning piece and we have some energy ideas. We need to get them to the right person. I just want everybody to kind of tell us how the best way to do that is. I copy the mayor on everything. I called him yesterday and said I was doing this presentation. I never want him to be surprised about something going on, because I want the Environmental Commission and anybody working on environmental sustainability to be trusted. So we are trying really hard also not to just kind of slide things under the radar, to make sure this is out in the open, everybody knows about it. So building trust in the process, I think, is one of the more important things that we have done. We're going to have Matt kind of take you through parts of how the comprehensive plan were created, and then I'll come back to the piece about how we then inserted the climate action plan, or pulled the climate action plan actually out of that comp plan.
All right, thank you, Allison. Yeah, so like she mentioned, I will kind of look at kind of the framework of how we built some items in the comprehensive plan and what it actually looks like in the final adopted document. And we did want to start with just a short introduction with the 2006 comprehensive plan, which, like Allison mentioned, had a pretty substantial sustainability and kind of conservation related section. I think this one was about 53 pages, was very dense, kind of hard to get through, even for staff. And I think some of our initiatives in here for like Brownsfield sites and certain redevelopment and that kind of thing did work out well. But in my opinion, a lot of the kind of goals and priorities that were laid out within this section weren't realized as much as the administration and consultants and everybody were hoping at the time of drafting and getting this plan adopted, especially with lack of dedicated staff time. 40 hours a week to work on sustainability was a challenge for any either any one person or various departments to implement a lot of these strategies. Next slide, please. So this is a brief page from the adopted 2019 or 2020 comprehensive plan about the public engagement. We had 715 public survey responses, multiple steering committee and stakeholder meetings, as well as public kind of general meetings. And we had Richmond residents identify parks, education, kind of downtown, vibrant downtown and redevelopment, health and safety, and public arts and cultures as their top 5 values that they really wanted to see integrated into our new comprehensive plan. And we in Richmond, I think our citizens really connect with our natural spaces through our parks. We have a great park system here. That and recycling is another big priority. So I think our planners and our consultants and everybody kind of jumped with that love for park spaces and that kind of aspect of the natural environment into integrating a lot of other sustainability and in some cases climate change language into the final adopted copy of the plan. You can go to the next slide. So we have 10 main components of this plan. Like it says on the screen, we had 5 mentioned and kind of are tightly linked with sustainability, which was like administrative policies, community services, economic development, utility growth, housing, and land use growth and redevelopment. And then along with land use growth and redevelopment, the other kind of key sustainability pieces were transportation, environmental areas, and parks and recreation all have a pretty strong tie with environmental concerns and sustainability. You can go to the next slide. And within the plan, a lot of these kind of main focuses are broken down into 4 sections for kind of like a regulatory framework where a lot of our objectives and implementation strategies and kind of policy recommendations are nestled in, which is GROW, which is concerned with land use development, and housing are kind of the main, housing and community services are our main aspects of that. CONNECT, which is very focused on multimodal transportation and neighborhood, connections between neighborhoods and people's residence to businesses and workplaces and all that kind of stuff. PROTECT, which is very focused on natural environment conservation and parks. And then CELEBRATE, which is kind of about, celebration of the success, communication from city government, collaboration with city residents, business leaders, and, everybody that lives within Richmond. You can go to the next slide. So this next slide is one of the kind of framework pieces from the PROTECT section that I just mentioned, which has a primary goal of resource conservation and protecting Richmond's natural areas. And then that is kind of funneled down into some primary objectives, which especially like number 3, encourage the development of citywide sustainability and resiliency strategies in the long term. And then each of these primary objectives kind of continues with some policy statements for a little bit more specific goals that based on public input and the planning expertise and everything they felt that the city can be focused on, which we will see in a couple slides. We use these primary objectives and policy statements kind of integrated within the climate action plan that we're still in the process of drafting to connect that plan as closely as we can with this already adopted comprehensive plan from last year. And next slide, please. And so after this is also from the PROTECT section, we have these program and project recommendations, which are placed in some kind of priority, different priority levels. So we have, for instance, the one that's circled on the screen is to adopt or appoint a sustainability coordinator, somebody that can be dedicated to working on environmental sustainability and kind of climate change related issues. Work with the Environmental Sustainability Commission to implement a citywide sustainability action plan, which is something that's also kind of in the works. And looking at some new zoning code updates for wetland, floodway, and floodplain protection, and each of these different sections, so like our land use development section has a similar thing with various objectives that are kind of drawn out as priorities moving forward. And with that kind of overview of some of the different sections of our comprehensive plan, I will pass it back to Allison.
Yeah, so to sum up, we're now then in the process of doing the climate action plan. And I think one thing that's annoying about webinars is when somebody gets on and they have all the answers and they've done everything right and everything is totally unattainable for anybody else. We are learning as we go, and certainly ERI has been insanely helpful in that, but we are still writing our climate action plan and we're supposed to be done with it already, but this route took a little bit longer, but I think we've actually got a good structure in place now. We understand, most importantly, how to get this through council too, and how to make it so that it's something that we're allowed to move forward with, I think is a really important thing. You can do these wonderful, robust and very aggressive plans, and then they aren't allowed to go anywhere. And that's the unfortunate part. So we're hoping that we don't have to deal with that. The comprehensive plans on the left there, and again, the small words don't matter. The climate action plan is on the right. You can see that they even in their design are matching each other. We're trying to make them seem as one document. But then if you look on the left, the primary objectives, like number 4 is about educating local residents and on emergency preparedness. So that goes right into the climate action plan and then for one of our strategies. And then another policy statement, which is encouraging the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, that goes right into the climate action plan too, so that every single strategy we have or every topic of concern, so this is residential weatherization, it has the objectives straight from Richmond Rising plan, which I put in the chat for people to look at. And then we have a justification section, right below it, a strategy section, and these are all still kind of in our early phases of messing around with. And then a climate resilience section that talks about how this is going to add to boost our resilience. It talks about what partners are involved, so we know who's in charge of this. And then Matt and I are messing around with the idea of at the end having a section of where kids can get involved. So if you're a child, how can you be involved in this? Does it mean learning about how your heat works at your house? Does it mean putting on an extra coat? That kind of stuff. So involving youth in some way, because we have youth climate surveys going around right now. So those pieces to learn how all of that kind of stuff integrates together was extremely important for us because again, and I'll say again, council has already approved our comprehensive plan. It has resilience language in it. It has adopt a sustainability coordinator in it. It has come up with a sustainability action plan or a climate action plan. Since it has all those statements in that plan, we're then gonna wrap that back into the climate action plan so that when we throw that at council, they're prepared for it. They've seen that language before. They're not surprised by things. And, you know, things that cost money are going to be a little bit of a struggle as they are across the board. But we feel like we're in a better place then to move things forward in an area that is not always focused on sustainability. So
That's you have about 1 minute left.
No problem. So this is just an up close look at the top of that page. We'll get fonts to match. That was my fault. But it talks about how Richmond's housing stock is very old and what we can do about that. And we're going to try to make everything, and we know not everything will do this, but try to make everything that relates to the citizens somehow. A lot of people in Richmond don't understand how climate change is impacting them. And so this, if we're speaking in language that they can understand and that they that is close to their heart, their homes, their wallet, then they should be able to absorb it a little more and be more supportive of the process as we go. So there's the second page to that. And so that's what we have. I can stop my share right now. But Andrea, I think we're ready for questions. Is that right?
Yes, we are. Thank you, all three of you, for your wonderful presentations. It's such practical advice. And we're seeing what's happening across the state. So thank you, Erin, for that. I also want to thank Lori for sharing the NAACP guide for integrating equity into the adaptation plans, which is probably relevant to any kind of planning process. So thanks for sharing that. We'll send that out via email too. So the first question that came in is, what was the total number of surveys sent out and what was the rate of response? And I believe that question was probably meant for Allison and Matt.
Yeah, Matt may have a better handle on this, but a lot of the surveys were sent out via social media. So we don't have a handle on how many people they went to. You can have kind of the engagement numbers, but not a super solid handle on it. I know that and Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, I know that the consultants were really happy with the number of surveys that were filled out because it was such a robust survey to have 750 people go through that in a town of 36,000, they were really pleased with. Matt, you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I unfortunately don't have any more concrete numbers than what Allison said. I know there was a lot of outreach done, like at community events, our farmers market, at some of our food pantries and stuff like that to try and reach various populations. But like I mentioned, unfortunately don't have any other information than what Allison shared.
All right, thanks. Aaron, one question that came in for you is you mentioned that there are, you're seeing a lot of climate comprehensive plans that are dealing with climate change, but they're not addressing climate change. So can you offer some advice, maybe based on your experience or what you've seen, to help local governments understand how they could get over that hump?
Yeah, so I think, and when I say dealing with rather than addressing, the only distinction there is that climate planning and I wish I had the data, we're still doing a sort of text analysis of all 178 of these comp plans for Indiana to try to look at what kinds of language they are using kind of throughout. But generally, the more that they are getting updated, if you look at some of the plans, regardless of size of the city, that have not been updated since 2010 or 2005. Those plans they're not working in language generally that is addressing or acknowledging flooding events, acknowledging environmental degradation. But most of the plans that are getting updated as of the last few years are working in that language. And I think it's in part just a acknowledgement of what everyone sees around them and feels around them, and understands that we are experiencing environmental change and seeing increased sort of consequences from that. So the only, kind of back to the scenario idea, I mean, the best way that I can sort of suggest that cities attempt to try to work in more specific, concrete climate strategy is to present, the positive scenarios and the negative scenarios. Obviously Gwinnett County is a huge government, so they have a lot of resources to engage or to utilize for their comp planning. But there are tools available right now for anyone to sort of create, 2 or 3 different scenarios for what 2040 or 2050 is going to look like. And so creating those scenarios, I think just makes the, instead of trying to force citizens to put environmental issues at the top of their priority list, it reframes this in terms of how can addressing these sort of changing environmental conditions improve my basic daily life. And that is something that I hear from my students. It's something that I hear from local governments themselves and from average citizens. So I think that halfway sort of addresses the question.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you, Allison and Matt. I know we have a number of questions that are still in the chat, but it's coming up on 1, so we'll have to end. But we will send the questions that have come in to our panelists today to see if they can answer them in advance of Friday or Monday when we send out our follow-up email. So thank you all so much. These presentations were wonderful, and we loved having a robust audience to present to. And we hope we'll see you all next time.